Okay, evening everyone. We'll just give people just a couple of minutes to join. Good to see a good crowd joining already. You've got the speaker bios hopefully in front of you, which you can see just while we wait. So we'll give it till 7:31 for people to join. I'll do a couple of quick introductions, go through a couple of Zoom housekeeping issues, if you like, and then we'll get started. But thank you for those who have joined so promptly. Though I can't see you, I am grateful for your attendance. I can see the number going up nicely. Okay, so just give it 30 seconds or so and we'll get started. As mentioned, a little reminder in front of you about who we've got today. So two really good guests, two former pupils of Shrewsbury School. Really, really grateful for them giving up their time. Okay. Right. So I'll stop sharing the screen. So welcome. I know that not everybody on this call is a Shrewsbury School pupil or parent, so welcome to those who go to a different school, a different college. You are more than welcome to join and participate in this webinar. We are looking at the theme of sustainable development and joined by two extremely experienced professionals. I said experts pre-call, I didn't like that, but certainly two very experienced individuals to talk us through. Also very grateful to Sapna, one of our lower sixth form students who's doing 4 A-levels and is also on the Eco Committee, who's agreed to help me out with the questioning this evening. Just a couple of very quick requests really before we get started. One is, so this is a webinar, but we do want you to interact, so please ask questions when asked to do so. Please ensure those questions are appropriate, and if they are for one of our particular panel members, make that clear. But keep the questions coming in and I will sort of manage that and pose those questions as we go. In terms of timing, due to finish at 8:15, but if you have questions which weren't answered and you wanted to make contact with either of the panelists, please do that through myself, through futures@shrewsbury.org.uk, and I will forward those questions on. So really pleased to welcome Rob York and Henry Unwin, and I'm going to hand over to Sapna to ask the first question to our panelists. Many thanks.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could provide an overview of what a typical week in your work might look like.
Well, I start that one. Well, thank you very much for that tricky opener, Satna. And hello, and thank you for having me on this discussion. I'm Rob York, and I live up in the Welsh Hills. I was in Riggs quite a few years ago. And to the question in hand, my average week, well, I wear 2 hats, one of which is as a rural charter surveyor. And I'm working with utility infrastructure, water mains and infrastructure across Southeast England. And with my other hat, I'm a rural commentator, which is slightly different. I write stuff, I chair debates, I moderate, broker environmental discussions, I write letters, I interview politicians and environmentalists, and I basically work for Dialogue within the environmental sector. Is that enough for starters?
Probably similar to me in that there is no such thing as a typical week. So I find, I guess for me, so I work at a farm called Dalesford Organics. So we've got about 3,000 acres of farmland, and we sell organic produce through a load of our own restaurants, pubs, farm shops, and we also sell direct to customers through Ocado and online. But yeah, so I guess a typical week is I'm based at the farm but slightly stuck in an office, so as much as possible trying to get out of the office and get onto the farm and remind myself why I'm doing what I'm doing. But a lot of it is we'll do farm tours, so showcasing what we're up to, bringing in guests and groups, and also groups of school children to try and inspire the next generation around sustainable food and farming. So a lot of time it's bringing people into the farm, teaching them what we're all about, but then I also spend a lot of time getting out of the kind of farm bubble, going to meet other people and understanding where we can learn from those that are doing some amazing work. So a lot of it is kind of out and about and networking, and then a big chunk of my work is researching. If we're looking at how do we capture soil capture carbon within our soil, a lot of my time is kind of spent researching, which is something after Shrewsbury University I never thought I'd be doing again, because I'm pretty rubbish at it. And then it's a fairly sociable place to work. So a lot of the days end up in the pub discussing life and work and everything in between. So, but yeah, not really a typical week. But yeah, it always throws up interesting things.
Henry, thank you. If I can ask you to respond to this first, and then Rob, in terms of what does that word sustainability mean to you? What does that mean, I guess, personally and professionally, from your perspective?
It's like everything and nothing. You know, you can hide a whole manner of sins behind sustainability. The amount of bullshit you see companies with sustainability in their, you know, in a tagline of a product, and then you actually look at what they're doing, it's unbelievable what you can mask behind that word. But if you capture the real meaning of it, it's unbelievable what you can do with it. So I mean, to me, so in terms of at work, we're looking at our sustainability strategy. So what does sustainability mean for our business? We've kind of put it into three areas. So one is about to regenerate. So it's all about regenerative ways of doing business. So regenerative farming. So that, you know, that might mean putting back more than you take out. Whether it's carbon, water, energy. So can we produce more energy renewably than we actually use? So regenerate means leaving this world with more than you arrived into it. To protect, so that bit of protection is to not cause destruction and look after really important habitats. To protect, you know, is to the kind of all of the stuff around reducing. So reducing packaging and plastic. And then the third bit for me is around inspiring. So it's all about how do we help create a movement around sustainable food and farming. So that's, I guess, like professionally what it means. Personally, I don't really know. I grew up on an organic farm, and I got very interested in biodiversity and conservation. So for me, it's really rooted in a love of the Cumbrian countryside and a realization that the single biggest threat to the thing that I loved in life was climate change. So sustainability to me is probably a bit more of a focus on climate and biodiversity than it does on other areas. But yeah, in essence, it kind of means everything, but also nothing at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I presume you're obviously asking me now, kind of, Chris. I've got a slight issue with the word sustainability, because about 8 years ago, I interviewed a professor, and he was the UK food security champion, Professor Tim Benton. And his whole thing was about sustainability. And I said in front of the Hay audience, I want my two panelists to talk about things, but to explain every time they use the word sustainability, what does it mean? Is it economic sustainability? Is it environmental sustainability? Is it social sustainability? Is it political sustainability? Now that really puts a few kind of tricky issues into it. And I remember reading the Farmers Weekly a few years ago. It said, we've got the awards coming up. We've got the arable farmer, the pig farmer, the sheep farmer, the sustainable farmer. And I wrote a letter saying, well, what do you mean by sustainable farmer? Does that by default mean all the rest are unsustainable? So they stopped that award quite soon. Not because of me, because of what the word means to so many people. But what Henry said, I agree on the aspect of regenerative, because for hundreds of years, we've been extractive. We've extracted stuff. The capitalist system, and we're already sliding into politics already, but everything is political. And that's an important aspect to realize early on when we're discussing sustainable development, or in fact, anything. And it's that kind of getting away from extractive exploitation towards harvesting and regenerative. And I remember when I interviewed Michael Gove, he was kind of virtual circle. Let's get into that virtual circle. It's not as easy as it's made out to be. And that's the journey, I would argue, that we're all on. It's a very exciting time. And I think that's enough from me on that one.
Okay, I suppose an obvious one. Thank you for your input so far. Rob, what made you work in this? You're clearly very passionate in terms of what you talk about. What inspired you to work in this type of industry, for want of a better expression? Is this something you thought of while you were at school, something you discovered later on? Just I suppose what fueled that passion? And Henry, I think you've touched upon that already based on your background, but Rob, if you could potentially respond to
sure.
that, that'd be great.
I have to say it was probably because I was brought up in the wilder, wetter parts of Great Britain, west of Scotland, west of England, west of Wales. And my father was in the Forestry Commission. And so I was always out in the wild environment. And then I did school, and I loved doing science, but I liked the arts at the same time. It's very tricky to do both. I seem to remember that at Shrewsbury. It's very hard to do art and science. And then I remember thinking Newcastle University, and I got offered a place to do zoology and geography. Fantastic. How exciting is that? Then I thought, what the hell am I going to do with that? So I thought, well, let's reappraise. And so I did rural land management at Royal Agricultural College, which is a Reading University degree. And it covered so many aspects which I found of interest, land, forestry, and this is back 1990, isn't it? And the word sustainability is really not on the radar, but the stuff I was doing within my projects were straight down the line about where my interest, working on the land, but more importantly, with people.
Henry, anything to add to that in terms of, you mentioned about your background? Is there anything potentially from your school experiences which inspired you to work in this area?
I feel like I should say yes, but
No.
definitely not. I enjoyed Shrewsbury for all the wrong reasons, and then ended up sneaking into Durham University to study environmental anthropology, which I guess was the first time I moved from having like an interest in sustainability to thinking, well, actually, this could be something you do as do with your life. So, environmental anthropology, all about the interactions of humans and the planet. But I left Shrewsbury in 2005, and there wasn't, Rob was, I'm not going to point out his age, but he was a bit before me, but a pioneer, so which makes him an absolute pioneer in this area. But I went into university in the very few degrees in sustainability. There were very few targeted degrees that really enabled you to move into that career. And when I left university, there weren't a huge number of jobs, but now it is such an exciting space to be. We are in desperate need of intelligent, enthusiastic people, and there's a lot of jobs out there.
I was going to ask that. I'm going to hand over to Sam in a second for the next couple of questions, but I'm really keen to hear from you both, partly for my role. Where's the gaps in terms of, if I'm advising a sixth form student or a fifth form year 11 student to go down this field, what kind of opportunities are there? What routes should they take? What are the career routes open to them? Henry and then Rob, if that's okay, if you could respond to that.
Just so that, there is, I guess the more obvious ones are in the kind of environmental sector, doing what Rob or I are doing. But actually, the really important space is the infiltration within within other areas. So, if you're in finance, we've got to leverage finance more sustainably. So if you're an investment bankers are seen as bad, but if you go into green investment and get people to change where they put their money. So, some traditional careers in business, law, finance, FMCG, marketing, you can still do those jobs, but go in as a sustainabilist, not as a marketeer. So I'd say there's some traditional jobs which are desperate for sustainability people.
Okay. Rob, what do you reckon?
Oddly enough, I've written down two things, food and finance. So Henry's already touched on the finance. I think it's a really important area that I think people say, what do you mean finance, kind of bankers? But what makes everyone tick? Finance, money, where we spend it. I think the other ones, I think we've got to be careful about the environmental sector. There's a bit of a roller coaster going on about let's do kind of environmental sciences and it's a little bit, I'm going to use an expression, a little bit woo-woo, okay? It's a little bit drifty. I think, and this is exactly, and I really agree with Henry on this, it's infiltrating construction and energy. Obviously energy that's renewable, but it's concrete. If you can find green concrete, if you can make concrete green, that's the biggie. Bill Gates, I haven't read his book, but he's saying there's no point doing anything else until you've dealt with concrete and reduced the emissions from that. And so for me, it's not very sexy, not very palatable to say, hey, let's do sustainability, and then say, actually, I'm working in concrete, but that's the place to be. I just want to add, Henry and I are not doing ourselves out of this discussion. That's, we have to push all the boundaries all the different ways, and we've got to look the opposite way.
Okay. Okay. Sapna, do you want to ask a couple of questions? Is that okay?
Of course. Just wondering, what are the biggest challenges that you're facing to be successful in your area of work, and are there like any sort of obvious solutions to those problems?
Shall I go? I mean, okay. A philosopher said, for every complex problem, there is an answer which is clear, simple, and wrong. So, on that note, it's the biggest challenges are, I think we've alluded to, or I've alluded to them, are possibly groupthink. Now, groupthink is when everyone is looking in the same direction and nobody is kind of checking both sides or kind of checking behind to see what alternatives or, where the tensions are. I'm talking in kind of riddles because it's a really tough question, that one. Just ask it one more time. Where do you see the problems lying? And I would say people. You have to get on with people. There's no point being a professor if you can't get on with people.
Henry, what do you think?
That's an interesting point. I think I use my sustainability, I'm not going to use the word expertise, but sustainability knowledge like 5% of the time. The rest is engaging with people, getting in the right room and in the right mindset and having the right type of conversation. So a challenge is getting into that room sometimes. So that's a big challenge.
Yeah.
Looking like really internally within our business, there's a challenge that I'm seeing at the moment is how do we scale, how do we really grow our business whilst keeping true to our core principles of local, sustainable, organic food. When our founders wanting us to set up shop in China and start selling local to the Cotswolds, delicious organic food flown in China. So that's a challenge. And then Rob's point about people, how do we harness the collective energy of people to do something about this crisis? Look what happens when people, like COVID has just shown us that we are able to get off and get off our backsides and properly tackle a challenge. And how do you harness that type of collective action towards the climate crisis?
Okay, talking of collective action, and some questions coming in. So please, I was about to say, please start posting questions. I'll have a look through those. I guess something which has been fairly well publicised in recent weeks, months, is the actions of Extinction Rebellion. Just wonder what your thoughts are really in terms of, how can I phrase this? Is that helpful? Is that harmful for your work? Just not looking to get too political, but I think it's an area we need to discuss really in relation to what we're talking about this evening. Who wants to field that one first?
Go on, Rob, you're twitching.
Go on, Rob.
I am twitching because Extinction Rebellion, I think, are doing an extremely valid thing. And it's partly due to frustration based on not just the political kind of machinations, which are very hard to maneuver, but just the tribal infighting between left and right, and also within the green movement. Within environmentalists, there's a huge amount of disruption. You have animal rights who are going up against conservationists. You have animal welfare getting confused with wildlife conservation people. So it's extremely hard to actually do anything. So I can see why, when you've got a void, it's going to be filled, and Extinction Rebellion have filled that. However, I think doorstepping David Attenborough at 6 o'clock in the morning, digging up the turf of Cambridge College, I think they could have maybe done a little more focus groups to see how this is going to play out in the public domain. And one last twist, I think Extinction Rebellion, they're going to spawn, they've got the people on the M25, and again, they're doing it because they don't believe they're being heard. But I think they've got to be careful when they tried to stop the tube going to Canning Town. They were pulled off it. And I think if environmentalists end up being the person on the tube being pulled off by those people just wanting to go to work, there's a danger that they're going to lose their audience.
Okay. Henry, thoughts? And then there's a couple of good questions come in which I want to share with you. So do you want to just respond to that one about rebellion?
They've got to exist. They need to exist because whatever's been happening so far hasn't worked. But also, I agree with everything that Rob said in terms of they've got to be doing more good than harm. And there's a kind of spin-off group that I don't think is Extinction Rebellion. the Insulate Britain guys, and they're on the news at 6 o'clock today. There's a woman trying to get to her mother who's dying in hospital. She couldn't get there. Ambulance drivers were trying to pull them off the road because they had someone in the back of an ambulance in critical condition. So having said that, I go on Extinction Rebellion marches, and I've also had to crawl to a hospital appointment 2 years ago because Extinction Rebellion had blocked the road for me, and I'm happy that they did. So, but I think whenever it was in 1850, there was a Eunice Foote, the scientist, who was a woman. So she didn't really make the history books, but she discovered the fact that carbon dioxide is causing climate change, and nothing's really changed since then. So there is a need for them, but they just need to be careful.
Okay, some great questions come in. I'm going to, just because there's quite a few of them, I'm going to sort of share in between you, if that's okay. Rob, do you think that the UK is behind in its sustainability development in comparison with the rest of the world? So where do you think we are in relation to, I suppose, other countries?
Perhaps yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, when it comes to, well, it all depends what metric we're going to be measuring. So if you look at biodiversity and wildlife, we're pretty low down the scale because we were the first country in the world in 1861 to become urbanized, i.e. we moved into cities. And so we were extracting everything, food from the countryside, remove the trees and the habitat to feed the cities. And so understandably, the UK is a bit tricky on that front. However, on the carbon emission reduction, they're doing very well. But the key thing for me is how do we compare a developed country like the UK, America, Australia, to developing countries, Africa, Myanmar, in Asia, who are just wanting to have what we had 100 years ago.
Okay.
That for me is the big challenge.
Okay. Henry, this one is from Daisy. Do you think there is enough care currently about climate change to have any significant effect? What do you reckon?
No.
No. Okay. Very short.
I mean, so I think 2015, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, it felt like we were at a tipping point, and it felt like there was enough. It felt like there was enough there then to make a massive difference. It feels like there's less now, which is, you need to ask a question that has a more positive answer.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm going to ask the next one, which I think we'll pick up, and I'll go back to Rob on this. So do you think the British public are supportive of sustainability, including farmers, consumers, politicians, etc.? Or are we at times just paying lip service to this? What do you think?
Well, I think, okay, well, I'm going to invoke Arab Spring. Arab Spring, as you know, in North Africa, where the Arabs basically, they revolted against their leaders, and in Tunisia, the key was bread. The price of bread went up, and so they tore down their political leaders because they were hungry. So I think if I was a politician in the UK, I would be keeping a weather eye out for ensuring the population were fed, because an unhappy population not being fed generally removes the politician, and thereby you aren't even at the climate talks because you're fighting between kind of politicians. So I think the UK is in a very unique position because we're very advanced in some of our thinking, but very divisive when it comes to the population, because we feel quite comfortable, and I don't think we're very good at thinking on the big scale and maybe drawing back a bit, deconsumption, but maintaining the capitalist system.
Okay, Satmana, do you want to ask the next question? I know you had a good one about the forthcoming climate change conference. Do you want to ask that? And then, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, please keep your questions coming in. Really keen to keep the quality of those coming in, please. Satmana, go for it.
So you mentioned the Paris Treaty already, and we have the COP26 conference coming up. I was wondering, do you have any things that you consider to be the main priority, or something that we feel the government should be dealing with first?
Over to you, Henry.
I think, well, Rob mentioned earlier, there's sort of two things, the finance and food. I just my worry with COP is maybe a lack of a focus on the role of food in climate change. So a third of human caused global emissions come from our food systems, and meat is responsible for 80% of deforestation. And whilst there's amazing ways to produce meat, there's also some pretty bad ones. I just wonder whether there isn't enough of a focus. They've got, I think, is it 6 themes. One is around nature, but there isn't really one connected to food and farming, which feels really important and is a really interesting way of connecting conversations between the UK and Myanmar or whoever it is. Everyone needs food, and everyone will continue to produce food. So I can't quite remember what the question was, but I think the answer to what might be missing from my perspective is food and farming.
Yeah. I mean, actually, a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed the chair of Natural England, and that was my final question: was if you were the chef at COP26, what would you serve to the global leaders and why? Anyway, you'll have to wait for that one, because I mean, I don't want to make this too comfortable, but yeah, I agree with Henry because food, and I deal a lot with scientists across the board, environmental scientists, conservation scientists, farming scientists. Every single paper starts with the greatest loss of biodiversity is due to habitat change. And that means farming, means feeding us. And so that is the elephant in the room, not to mix my metaphors. Everyone gets more excited about trophy, maybe hunting and kind of trophy hunting, but actually the big elephant is how we feed ourselves. But more importantly, and I'm slightly repeating myself, it's how the rising Asian population, the developing world, how they feed themselves and have what we had. And I would hope that at COP26, that politicians could be smarter and not just play to the media headlines, and try and get some more nuanced messaging between how we live our lives every day and what impact it has, not just on carbon, but on food, which is related to biodiversity as well. It's very complex, and that's what politicians hate.
Yeah. And what I'd love, sorry, just to jump in, what I'd love, this is maybe a slightly naive perspective, but I would love, one of the political leaders to stand up there and say, shit, I don't know what we need to do. Let's get into a big conversation about what are the solutions we need, instead of going up there and saying, we've made X improvements, we've got net zero 2050, we're all over this. It'd be so refreshing for someone just to say, I'm drowning and let's get together and help.
Yeah.
I think that, sorry, just to jump.
Yeah, go for it.
No, because I want to hear more questions, from the guys out there. It is that we had about 10 years, I don't know, a few years ago. Yeah, it was 10 years ago, 2010, the Akshay targets for biodiversity, the targets for this. And when you set targets which are too unrealistic and then you fail, they are used to beat you.
Yeah.
So they're used as a weapon against you. And I think that's exactly where politicians need to be realistic. They have to be ambitious. And Greta Thunberg is obviously doing a lot of that. But if they're too overambitious, you're going to lose the audience. And that's the population who have got to actually change their habits.
Great questions been posted. I want to share it with you, and I welcome your response, for both of you, if that's okay. It's from Lewis. How important are ethics when it comes to making big steps towards dealing with climate crisis? Also, do you encounter ethics often within your roles? So it's a question about ethics, climate crisis, and then in terms of your own individual roles, how big an issue that is for yourselves. Who fancies fielding that one initially? Any volunteers?
No,
that's
not
were you pointing towards Henry then?
Okay.
Okay.
How important, super important. Rob's talked about this. I guess the concept is called climate justice. How do you you've got contraction and convergence. So how do countries like the UK contract their emissions, and how do you enable development of less developed countries who are aspiring to livelihoods that we've set a precedent for? How do we enable that to happen in a way that is fair and just, and they deserve and need energy. So really important from that perspective. In terms of my role, so my previous role is probably more significant. I spent 5 years at the restaurant group Nando's, leading all their sustainability work, and we had a lot of projects in Southern Africa where we grew a lot of all of our chilies, but also we had a big supply chain all across the world, and ethics in fashion and in farming are there's some very good stuff and there's some very, very bad stuff. So the importance of making sure that there was absolute proper labour, fair labour, no child labour, no modern day slavery within our supply chain was very, very important.
Great stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I have a slight kind of difficulty with this. One person's child labour is another person's child in happiness out in the rice field with no shoes. How do we, some of the Extinction Rebellion people don't just want to reduce carbon dioxide. They would like to take fossil fuel companies and get them to pay reparations. Now, I think it's a really interesting area. But I want Shell and BP and Coca-Cola and Nestle to be in the room. They've got billions. I don't want them to be taken to the cleaners because ethically they don't sit with some of the other aspects. Organic farming can go very well with genetic engineering.
My dissertation at university was about genetic engineering and whether it's got a role in farming, and I think if it was owned by different people, it would be in a good spot. And just to your point, Rob, on child labour, we carried out an impact assessment in one of our farms in Malawi, and the mother was so predominantly women farmers farming chilies, and they're in the fields with their kids. Their kids were playing around, having a great time, and were also picking chilies. Technically, that is unpaid child labour, which we could have been in a huge amount of trouble for, but it was a wonderful thing that these kids were experiencing, part of their childhood growing up when school, out of school hours. So it's sort of slightly murky water.
Yeah. And I think everyone has to be curious and aware of that as we come to COP26, to scrutinize what people say. Don't always take it for face value. There are underlying kind of narratives. There's not just good and bad. It's not so binary.
Okay. Sapna, do you want to ask another question? We've got around just over 10 minutes, so please keep your questions coming in. Sapna, if you're okay to ask a question, if that's all right.
Yeah. So reflecting on your career today, what's the biggest impact that you personally had on any of your jobs or roles?
I got a job. That's my proud. I managed to get a job, having been told by lots of people there's no way it's going to happen.
Right.
But my proudest moment, I ran an event at COP21, and I just felt very lucky to be there, and it felt like a really exciting time, and I think that was definitely my proudest moment. And then
What was the event, Henry? What was it you did?
So it was with a charity that I worked with called Bioregional, which was all about so they did a development called BedZ down in South London, and it was all about demonstrations of sustainable solutions. So like what the type of development, if you're looking at the target set out in the Paris Climate Change Agreement, what type of developments do we actually need that would deliver that? And they had a zero carbon development at scale in South London. They're also doing things in Bicester and Paris as well. So it was bringing together a group of people, and including business leaders. So there's a guy from B&Q who led all of their FSC sustainable timber stuff. And it's like trying to set out, here lots of people are talking about a sustainable future, but it's what does it actually mean? Here's a business that is embracing that. Here's a sort of construction company and a community developer who've delivered some of those solutions.
Okay. Rob?
I think probably asking people like the environmentalist George Monbiot and the politician Michael Gove and some others some kind of tricky questions, so they had to kind of scratch their head rather than just give me a glib usual answer. And I think the other kind of proud stuff is getting a bit of feedback from students or from other people saying, I don't agree with you, Rob, but you've made me really think about that.
Yeah. And
for me, my role is done.
Okay. We've got time. A couple of great questions are being posted. Emily, I'm going to just read this one out. Is the climate crisis going to be best solved by authoritarian states with long-term plans that they can commit to with a certain level of guarantee, compared to Western governments who rely on popularity to be voted in every 4 years? So quite a long question. If you want to have that, if you just click on the Q&A button, chaps, you should be able to see that's quite a long question, but quite an interesting one, I think. Thank you, Emily, for posting that. Henry, Rob, anyone fancy a stab at responding to that?
I'll just kind of roll into it. I'll just take the punch.
Thank you.
No, but when I say roll into it, because actually, if you've got a benign dictator, they're not, they're not invulnerable. And this is back to food. Don't forget, in France a couple of years ago, and I'm not saying France is under dictatorship, obviously, but do you remember when they increased the price of fuel and the yellow shirts came out? Everybody,
yeah.
A yellow vest, and so they shut down the place there. And farmers in France, if they don't like things, they spray the government office with manure and shut down the motorways. So I hear what Emily's saying about if you've got a short-term populist government, but I think every ruler is in a highly concerned position, wanting to do the best for the world, for future generations, and also to be able to stand on the stage alongside other global leaders. But at the same time, they've got to keep their population in the room, so to speak. They've got to say, and without affecting, don't forget, the people at the other end of the spectrum on lower incomes are spending 20% of their income on food. The average person is only 10% on their food. So all of that is got to be factored in.
Okay. Henry, anything to add to that at all? Do you want me to move to the next question?
Well, no, I'm just thinking, I wish I could have asked questions like that when I was at school.
I know.
A very good question, which I really don't know the answer to. You sort of think 4 years is just too short term to make some of the decisions that we need. But then imagine getting the wrong person in power for more than 4 years.
Imagine
so
that.
I honestly don't know what. I can't give you an answer.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to respond to this one then first, Henry, and it's a yes or no, really. It's from Jam. I don't know if that's an abbreviation. Our reliance on fossil fuels has to stop soon if we're going to be sustainable. Do you agree?
Yes, yeah. Our use of energy will always be there and continue, but the whole concept of keep it in the ground, the fact that there are enough profitable identified reserves of fossil fuels in the ground to take us way over the amount of global warming that we want to get to, below 1.5-2 degrees. So we've got to keep it in the ground.
Yeah, Rob.
Yeah. Again, I'm just going to split the differences. Coal, oil, keep it in the ground. Gas, I think we've still got to play with gas because you could reduce the emissions coming from gas. We have to have a transition. Okay, we need that transition. Otherwise, people are going to drop off the edge of a cliff, especially the less well off. If you look at the Oxfam report on the upcoming kind of COP conference, it's tough reading because it's all about poverty will increase as we go more towards going away from fossil fuel. We need to go away from fossil fuel, but it has to be a transition. It can't be an ideological, dogmatic process. It's got to have a lot more nuance in it. But we have to invoke technology, and some of the technology is owned by big companies. Again, you might have to get into bed with people who can help do that.
We've got time for one more, and one more from the audience. If anyone has anything else which hasn't been answered, and I suppose it's in relation to the audience, the majority of whom will be sixth form pupils, maybe a few fifth formers. I suppose general advice, and both of you be welcomed in terms of what could they do now to really sort of increase their understanding of some of the key issues we've spoken about tonight. They're obviously interested, they've attended, they've sort of listened, but what's the next steps for our students in terms of really sort of building and developing their knowledge? Rob, any thoughts?
I would hang with as many points of view as you can. Learn to tolerate, but above all, be curious and be slightly disruptive, not necessarily an agitator, but a disruptive, because you could be disrupting a conversation which is going into the same cycle, and you disrupt it to go to a new place. So, go and explore some of these universities or kind of colleges. Ask. I think that's back to being curious. Ask, even if it's online, which I think is sometimes harder.
Yeah. Push
buttons which you wouldn't normally push.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. Henry?
We need to find something to disagree on. I agree with that. I think the be curious one's interesting. Read stuff that you don't agree with. My feed is just full of stuff that reinforces my little bubble of thinking. So read stuff that you don't agree with. One of the people I respect most is a friend of mine from Cumbria who's totally against climate change, but she's read more books than I have on it. And it's just like, at least, read beyond your kind of stuff that doesn't reinforce. Like, don't stress. Like, do not stress out and think, what am I going to do? I graduated the day after I graduated. I managed to get a job. I had no idea what I was going to be doing when I was doing my exams. Don't stress about it, and don't over focus before people are going straight from uni into a really specific master's. How do you know that's what you want to do your master's in the day after you leave university? So there's something about taking a holistic approach to sustainability, or whatever you call it, and then understanding where you might go within it. It's such a big, broad field, but I also think don't stress about it. I didn't get stressed. I managed to get a job.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question to finish with. We've spoken about a lot about the upcoming conference, etc. 10 years time, let's imagine we are in 2031. Are we still going to be discussing and debating the same issues, or do you anticipate there potentially will be new issues emerging over the next decades in relation to climate change, environmental issues, and ultimately sustainability? Henry, and then Rob to finish us off. Henry, what do you reckon? 10 years time, still the same issues, or do you think it's going to have evolved?
Yeah, I think the same issues, but some incredible things will have happened. We will also have seen some incredible things that we might not want to see. But we are talking about the same issues today as I started off my career 10 years ago. Is the same kind of stuff.
Okay.
But we will have seen some amazing innovations, but also some probably alarming impacts of climate change in the 10 years as well.
Okay. Rob, to finish it off.
And I think we almost need to see those impacts, because I think that will make the populations, without the politicians, without the grandstanding, this is going to sound pretty terrible, some lemmings will go off the edge, so to speak. I don't mean that as people, but situations over the next 10 years will happen. But the great news is this generation, the one, who are engaged now, the lower six, the upper six, you are the ones who are going to be part of the solution. And I think a lot of the solution will be looking outwards, not looking inwards, looking outwards, looking globally. That big interface between the UK, the kind of US, let's say the West, the developed, and Asia and Africa. Africa's the place to watch on many fronts. And if you can work on that nexus between Africa, Asia, and the developed world in all of this huge subject, that's the place to be.
Okay. Gentlemen, that has been fantastic. Thank you ever so much for your time, your input, your advice, your guidance to our students. Sapna, really well done. Thank you for helping ask some really good questions this evening. Massively appreciated. Ladies, gents, if you do have any questions which you perhaps think about in the next 24 hours, 48 hours, think, I really should have asked that. Again, feel free to email me and I'll forward those on to Henry or Rob accordingly. Hopefully you found it really useful, really helpful, and hopefully it certainly has for myself, given me plenty to think about in the days, months ahead. Chaps, we'll leave it there. Sapna, many thanks. Pupils, both from this school and from further afield, many, many thanks for joining in. Thank you all. Take care.
Cheers, Chris. Cheers, Sapna.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Henry.